We live in, shall we say, politically divisive times, which, contrary to some's belief, is no different than really any other point since humans started humaning, from ancient Rome to relatively modern times and the likes of Thomas Jefferson secretly bankrolling Scottish scandalmonger James Callender to attack Jefferson's presidential opponent and former best friend, John Adams, among other things accusing Adams of being mentally deranged and, to quote Callender, a hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. In the end, politics has always been messy, with the vast majority of things published in the news covering it very intentionally inflammatory with highly questionable accuracy. And things haven't exactly improved since, though also contrary to seemingly popular sentiment, as anyone who studies history in any depth will tell you, while the world today is far from perfect and a lot to fix, the best time to be alive for pretty much everyone is quite literally right now for innumerable reasons, all summing up to the past was the worst. But we're not here to debate that can of worms with you today, but rather talk a little bit about how the US government actually functions from a practical, day-to-day perspective. Along the way, we'll be looking at the practical side of the election process, who actually runs everything, how the government pays for things and manages debts, what would happen if a city ran out of money, or if the US federal government could no longer pay on its massive debt, and at what point the US national debt becomes unsustainable. We'll also be looking at how government manages to transcend party politics and actually get things done, including covering the Aunt Sally effect and why it's so effective at helping at the level government likely affects you most, and we even look at how one gets a TED Talk and what the process of doing one is like, which I promise makes sense in context. And perhaps in all, restore your faith in government a little bit along the way, because while popular political news will likely have you thinking the world is doomed and leave you seriously considering alcohol as a phenomenal life strategy, it turns out, as shocking as this may come to some, governments the world over are run by people. Not a handful of shadowy individuals controlling everything, except for, of course, Grabthar, praise be his name, but in fact, lots of people, literally millions of them. In fact, the largest employer in the United States by far is the United States government, followed by Walmart and Amazon, then a security company called Allied Universal of all things, an IT company called Accenture, then FedEx and UPS, which I'll leave you to what that all says about the US and its people. But when talking government, it's not just the people at the top in the leaders of nations, but the people at a much less talked about level that are the ones generally actually doing things in a much less heralded way to make sure society does not collapse and otherwise runs as well as it can. While no system is perfect, this is a level which is typically far less polarized and maybe unsurprisingly is mostly filled with people trying to do the best job they can for the communities, states, and the country they live and raise their families in, because hey, they live here too. Now, to dive into all this, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of me talking at you about it all, we decided to bring in an expert in the field, Eric Mason. Beyond giving a TED Talk related to this, if not here, where, in which he discusses the power of local government to make huge changes at not just the local, but national level, Eric is also the CFO of the City of Presidents, Quincy, Massachusetts. When he's not managing their around $500 million annual budget, helping to make sure the city he grew up in continues to thrive now and the foreseeable future, Eric is also an occasional keynote speaker on all things finance, government, and world economics, and on the side teaches microeconomics at West Virginia University. And when he's not doing all that, Eric can be found nerding out on history, including on the Buck Starts Here, a History of Presidents podcast, link below, as well as for over a year now in an on and off again debate with me on which US president would win in a battle royale style tournament. Stay tuned on that one, because while it will be an insane amount of work to put together, the answer to that question is one we here at Today I Found Out want to know, and our team of abnormally attractive nerds we keep chained in the basement are going to be working on a documentary on later this year, or else they'll get the hose, because a lot of interesting history embedded and a great vehicle to teach it all with. But for now, let's look at how government actually works from a practical standpoint and see if along the way you don't have your faith in government restored, and maybe shift your focus a titch from the polarized and generally highly sensationalized national level to where things actually typically are getting done, who is doing them, and how it all works. So let's dive into it all, shall we? And after listening, let us know if you like this format and would like to see us bring on more experts in various things on occasion for similar style discussions. All right, so Eric, welcome. Welcome to the show. So today, again, we want to talk about like local government. You work in local government. You're very high level on it, and just kind of want to see because I feel like so many people think like this is the way government works, and then there's other people who just don't have any clue and like just sort of educate people on how things actually work. And also, I wanted to talk about because you did that TED talk
Yeah.
on sort of like touching on local government. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I was very fortunate that I was my alma mater, West Virginia University, which is where I got my bachelor's and master's degree. I was invited down a few years ago to give a TED talk on. The name of my TED talk was "If Not Here, Where," and I discussed the importance of local government, and also broadly the importance of humanizing people who are oppositional to your cause. The idea that there's an old saying in politics, all government is local, and what I've discovered in my time I've been fortunate enough to be in local government is that a lot of these big, huge national issues have started to boil down and started to trickle down, I should say, to at-home issues. And what we forget is that the vast majority of times people interact with any form of government, it's with your local government. Your schools are local government, your police are local government, your fire department's local government, your elections are local government. And sometimes we get caught up in this national dialogue and we forget that the very people who are operating government are the same people you play baseball with, or in my case, I've filled up the tires on, growing up, and the cars are the vast majority of people who live in Quincy. And my TED Talk was really focusing on reminding people and showing people that at the end of the day, these big national issues are certainly important, but the real action of government is done locally. You drive by your government every single day. It's not in DC, it's on Main Street.
Well, yeah, and I think that's interesting too because when you look at like the federal elections and things, everything is so incredibly polarized at this point.
Yeah.
And I feel like at the local level, you have a little bit more, people working together a little bit for sort of that reason.
Yeah, there's a great terminology that our mayor, Mayor Koch, said to me when I first started. I was 21 when I started working at the city. He said, pothole politics. There's no left or right to a pothole. It has to be filled in. I've always kind of liked that attitude.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so yeah, let's jump into uh, let's start with elections, like the nuts and bolts of elections from like the practical standpoint. How do you guys handle that when you have a local election?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do encourage anybody listening to this who's curious, go talk to your local clerk. Your local town clerk or city clerk, in the case of like a Quincy, they love explaining this to people. I was often, funny. I'm very fortunate to have had, the experience I've had being able to see the inner workings of local government. And it was funny when people talk about, different election results. And I often am confused because they sound like it's like a state board or federal board that certifies election. No, it's the individual clerks in each municipality across the country. And when I say municipality, I'll probably use that term a lot. Municipality, that's local. Your local government or your county government are considered municipalities wherever you are in the country. In Massachusetts, our local government, which is your cities and towns, tend to be the most dominant form of municipal government. The rest of the country, like where my wife's from, West Virginia, it tends to be county level. But it's those individual clerks and the election boards that certify the elections. And I got to tell you, one of the most interesting things is, during we're like a month and a half removed from the presidential election. Is when I would leave work at night, I'd walk by all the sealed ballot boxes, all the bags locked up, and it's an operation. I mean, we employ hundreds of election workers every year because in Massachusetts we have off-year elections too. So every year it's a well-oiled machine, and they're everything from sending out ballots to ensuring the integrity of ballot boxes. That's all handled locally. The guy umping your local t-ball league is probably the same person who is validating the election. It's not some like shadowy over figure. It's a guy you could probably go have a Bud Light with after work.
So let's say like a mayoral election. I was curious when you get like a different mayor. So when you get like a different president, there's always a different cabinet and all these sorts of things. What sort of happens when you get a different mayor? Is there a lot of turnover? Is it just everybody pretty much stays the same except mayor, or like how does that work?
Generally speaking, and fortunately, I have not gone through a mayoral turnover, but I have many colleagues who have. Generally speaking, most of the staff stays in place. I mean, Quincy's been a city since 1888, and we've had only a handful of clerks, which, if you think about city clerks, are incredibly important pieces of local government that deals with everything from birth certificates, death certificates, to marriage certificates, to elections. We've only had a handful of them. We've only had a handful of city treasurers. It's funny. I have a bunch of tax bills from Quincy in like the late 1890s to mid 1900s. It's like only two different names for the treasurer. My position, which is chief financial officer, so I wear two hats. I'm the chief financial officer and I'm the director of municipal finance. We've had three since my office has been created in the late 2010s. Late 20 aughts, and none of that had to do with turnover. There's just retirements and people moving on. I always put it this way: like the new mayor who comes in, they have a policy they want to do, and the worst thing to execute in your policy is to remove all the people who understand the day-to-day function of government. Like it's
Yeah.
it's less akin to a president coming in and removing a secretary, more of a president coming in and just being like, "Do you know what? We're going to remove all middle management." It's like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
going to really affect your ability to make changes. That's going to affect your ability to pave the roads. Getting rid of a DPW commissioner is going to change the pacing for road repairs. Getting rid of a plan, the head of planning would change your ability to get new projects done throughout the city. And a lot of us, we're apolitical. Like we are, I could not tell you the political leanings of 99% of the people I work with. And a lot of times in local elections, they're nonpartisan. Like our mayor doesn't belong to a political party. He's neither Democrat nor Republican. He's just not enrolled.
Hmm.
And that's very true with a lot of mayoral elections, is that there simply isn't a partisanship to it. It's who can do the best job. Like I love Quincy. I'm a Quincy guy. My family owned a business in Quincy for 75 years. My parents still live in Quincy. And at the end of the day, it's not about the politics of it. It's about, am I making the best financial decisions? Or regardless of what role you are you making the best decision given the powers of your role to better the city you love? And I'll tell you, nobody runs to be the chief elected officer of a city and doesn't love the city. So you tend to gravitate towards people who also love the city you love and just are using their talents in a specific role to better off that municipality.
Yeah. Well, and I would think also, yeah, like especially when you're talking about like your position, like would anyone else? I mean, you have like your hands in all the overseeing, like all the financial side of everything, and so like could someone just step into your job? Like it doesn't seem like really possible
Oh no, we're all replaceable.
without.
We're all
Yeah.
replaceable. You could find somebody a lot smarter and better looking than me to take over my spot. I came into my position, on the day the state shut down from the pandemic. I was 26. If I could do it then, I'm more than certain. There's a lot of talent around me. There's a lot of talent in this state that could certainly replace me. It's not just me. Like I often say, like if I disappeared, if I got hit by a bus or something, the city would function fine. Probably not the best thing to say for my job security, but it's because a lot of the day-to-day operations are done by very seasoned and experienced people who know what they're doing. My director of accounts, my strategic asset manager, my financial ops, my business manager, they are all experts at what they do. And I often say my job is to be a cheerleader for their causes and for the causes of the city. But more importantly, my job is structural. I'm supposed to cover weaknesses and accentuate strengths. And that's what you do a lot when when you run a department in a city. Is that you are very attuned. Like I still do the city's tax rate. I'm still heavily involved in the budget process. That's how I got started, and I still very much like it. Though I'll tell you, my financial ops manager is blown me out of the water in his ability to do his job, which is largely doing the budget too. But it's that specialization at that level, that upper management level, that really helps. Where as a department head, you're trying to, like I said, accentuate strengths and cover weaknesses. But no, absolutely not. Somebody could come. I'm under no illusions that I'm like a unique animal here, and you can't replace me. We'll be fine.
What does so like we're talking about that? Let's start at the very top. What does a mayor actually do? Like, what's their day to day? What do they do at work?
It,
How does that work?
Exhausting. I don't know. I got to be honest with you. I have a lot of respect for anybody who wants to do that job. It's so in a lot of paperwork we see that we sign off on. The mayors are part of a group of political figures called chief administrative officers, and you really have three types of chief administrative officers in the United States. You have town administrators, town managers, and mayors. Uh, Good random like quiz is the difference between a town and a city is a city as a mayor. Um, Also, cities have ordinances, towns have bylaws, and if you ever I'm turning into one of those salty people that when I was younger, I'd be like, "Why would you ever correct somebody saying that?" And I corrected one of my interns recently when he used the term bylaws. Actually, we have ordinances, and I was like, "Oh, I got to
What's
wash my
the
mouth out. Why did I say that?"
what's the distinction there?
Oh, there's no distinction. It's just being petty.
Okay. All right.
um, so I mean, it's exhausting. So those chief administrative officers are the top of local government, but there's no more top of local government than a mayor. In Massachusetts, we have Plan A form of government. There's all different plans of government you can have, and in Plan A, that's called a strong mayor government, and that's when the mayor has, very wide sweeping executive authority. The city council is the ultimate body when it comes to appropriation and the passing of ordinance. But when it comes to the execution of day to day government, that falls solely on the mayor. And so it's everything from sitting in emergency management meetings, how you're going to deal with hazard mitigation plans, how you deal with flooding, from development. Like mayors are usually very heavily involved with when development reaches land disposition agreements. So that's negotiating on behalf of the city, from everything for in Quincy for the lease of land for a golf course to we're building a medical office building. And the mayor, I always say, as a department head, part of my job is that the mayor is the individual who sets the course of the city because he's elected by the people. That's who the people choose to lead the executive branch. And what he does is he then delegates to people, and he's very good at delegating to people of skill sets where, okay, if it's a financial issue, it's me and my team that deals with it. If it's a legal team, it's a solicitor's office. So it's a lot of delegation, but it's not delegation as in, then he gets to sit down and relax. It's delegation to people who have the time to be experts in that individual field or to speak to experts in the individual field. It's meetings after meetings after meetings, and it's, there's a lot of social side to being the mayor too. That what I've noticed, like his job is 24/7. There is no going away. I've driven up to when he's been on vacation in like Maine to have warrants signed because it needs a wet signature on it to be able to process AP checks, and it never bothers him. And I'm sitting there like, I don't know if I could do a job that's just 24/7. Everything
Mm-hmm.
from ribbon cuttings for new, if a new sub shop opens up, he'll be there at a ribbon cutting, tons of wakes. But then on the day-to-day technical side, he has to be an expert in every function of the operation of the city, and that's where it gets unique to me. See, the city functions much like a conglomerate, where we have developmental arms, right? You have the planning office that's constantly analyzing every single development that's going on. We have planning board and zoning board that are full of awesome volunteers who help that process and lend their expertise in making sure projects reflect the goals and needs of the city the best they can. But then you even take a next step, and when you talk about guiding the city forward, adding new departments, realigning departments. I've been part of 6 different new departments and departmental consolidations, and having the foresight to align, these new departments. That's part of the chief elected officer. A lot of times you'll see like chief elected officer if it's a mayor. So I always joke there's a CEO. It's not chief executive officer, it's chief elected officer. But
Mm-hmm.
everything you would imagine like a private sector CEO doing, imagine that, but mixed with management responsibilities, not just pure executive function. And it is really tiring to watch somebody do that. I sit there and go, wow, I think I'm a pretty high energy person, but I don't think I'd have the energy to be able to, go nonstop from 8 o'clock in the morning to whenever he leaves his last wake at night. And, our mayor's
Mm-hmm.
been doing it 20 years now. Other mayors I know across the state do the same thing. And it is really a unique person who wants to do that job. And I applaud anybody who can do that.
Well, and also I was looking at a little bit ago. I was just researching some things on like mayors and how government works and things, and I was amazed how little relative to the work they put in and their position. I feel like, especially for a city the size of Quincy, how little mayors actually get paid. That it blew me away.
Yeah, yeah. While we were doing that research, you probably saw the recent discussions we've had in Quincy regarding that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, one of the things that is interesting is that if you look at the responsibilities to what a mayor has, especially compared to a private sector counterpart,
Yeah.
it's the pay is interesting. The pay is, my background's labor economics. It's pronouncedly lower than what you'd expect, and it is funny because
Mm-hmm.
you do hear a lot where people say they want more private sector in their government, and but we don't have to go to the private sector to find comparable, much higher paid positions. If you look at chancellors of colleges and provosts and heads of nonprofit hospitals, heads of your local nonprofit. I mean, there's some YMCA directors who make considerably more amount of money over smaller budgets. But I think a lot of that stems from is people are vastly underestimate the size of their local government. Uh, the New York City has the largest municipal budget in the United States, and the only Fortune 500 company that surpasses it is Microsoft. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, Apple's operational budget is half what New York City's operational budget
Whoa.
is. I mean, Quincy. I teach. I used to teach when youth in government. Uh, I used to volunteer to teach that. It was one of my favorite things that I teach. And one of the questions I'd ask is like, how big do you think this city's government you live in? And 50 million, 20, 100 million. Like, no, it's a $500 million operation. The city of Quincy spends about $1.5 million a day to operate, and that
Whoa.
blows people's minds. Like, it's that big of an operation? And I'm like, yeah, it's municipalities tend to be the largest business in their city unless you're the municipality of a large city. And then once you get so big, then you're New York, and New York probably has the largest operational budget of any company based in New York City.
Well, yeah, it just means because like they do get paid like okay, but yeah, when you're talking about they're essentially the CEO of a major corporation type of level, and yet their pay is I don't know, it just blew me away.
With very
It
little
was
job security, if you think about it.
yeah right yeah right you got a few years and then you're back on the campaign trail. Yeah, and it just seems like it would be it would be better or beneficial to actually bump that way up to be a little more in line with what you see on some of these big CEOs and stuff like that. Because, I mean, I could see why that wouldn't work as an elected official because people would be like, oh, they make so much money. But at the same time, when they're managing so much and so much that directly influences everyone under their, electoral, region, I don't know. It just seems like you'd attract better candidates, or almost like a little bit like teachers, where teachers, generally get paid really crap based relative to their education levels and their continued education that they need, and it's like one of the most important positions we have because they're literally teaching everyone that's growing up and just for society. So it seems like the similar thing with like a mayor or these sorts of positions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting parts I've noticed throughout, especially the dialogue we've had over the last year regarding this type of analysis, is that it's just difficult to analyze because there is such little data of these types of increases. I think one thing I found interesting was I recently looked up how much George Washington was paid because I thought that would be interesting, and he was paid $25,000,
Mm-hmm.
which is equivalent to $1 million today. And I mean, the president right now is like the lowest paid presidents have ever been, and I just think that's
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
kind of funny. I mean, you know this, but up until Eisenhower, we didn't really have there's no pension plan for presidents. Like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Harry Truman,
Well,
like pretty much died like
yeah.
penniless.
Well, and Truman was a good one because I'm pretty sure he was the one, right, where he had lots of job offers after, but he did not want to cheapen the office of the presidency,
Yeah.
and so he would not take them. Like because he was the president, they didn't want him. They wanted the former president, is what he thought, and so he wouldn't take the position. Like,
Yeah, no, absolutely. My favorite random. I don't. This he does obviously doesn't count as a president, but Jefferson Davis sold insurance. Was a head of an insurance company. I just think that's funny.
yeah. But yeah, so let's see here. What when looking okay now below the mayor, what are the other main offices that run everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a bunch of obviously the chief of staff is the point person, and how the chief of staff basically functions is that they're kind of the top unelected official, where their job is to take what the mayor wants executed and convert that from kind of the policy and directional aspect to the tangible task making. So like a position like mine works very very closely with our chief of staff. It's I put it like I always say I think I have the funnest job in government. I think most people at my level think they have the funnest job in government. I think that's kind of part of the
Mm-hmm.
attitude is that the mayor once said to me, he goes, you know, you pick somebody, you put them in a job like yours because they want to do that job. And they should
Mm-hmm.
look at every other job and go, oh, that looks horrible. I'm happy I get to do mine. But
yeah.
the chief of staff basically functions as the flag bearer. And they sit with the city council. So of course they're not a voting member, or an elected member, but they sit at every city council meeting and represent the argument or the position, I would say, of the administration. And then you get into what we call commissioners. So commissioner is like a very very high ranking position. It's C-level for the public sector. And there's a bunch of different ways different states define what commissioners are. But the best way to think of a commissioner is they oversee multiple departments with multiple different tasks. So your DPW commissioner, they would oversee your roadway improvements, the engineering of the city, water and sewer facilities if they're under the control of the local municipality, But even like snow and ice and drain management, a commissioner of natural resources doesn't just oversee parks, but they oversee forestry, which is a hugely different thing. Like anybody, there's a great subreddit that's like tree law. That's just like always hilarious to read how just how precise tree laws are in the United States, and that's really your tree warden, which is a hugely important person in a municipality. I mean, it's with how much the United States went through like deforestation on the urban level through like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's amazing how much our our really dense cities have flourished because of tree wardens, enforcing those laws and allowing the breakup of heat islands. But so commissioners are also like your your commissioner of natural resources. They oversee your cemeteries. Municipalities are still usually, I think they statistically, I looked this up fairly recently, are still the largest provider of cemetery plots in the United States. And that's macabre, but like maybe a kind of beautiful because it kind of shows that the permanency of a municipality, right? That it's going to maintain something that's as endless as a cemetery. And we do that through many interesting financial vehicles that do that. But it's their responsibility to make sure people's final resting places are preserved and honored. And so that commissioner level, they're able to then go down to some departments. There's only a director. Much larger departments have commissioners, and those commissioners then usually go down to the director level, and will say, "Hey, director of, let's say for example, like director of cemeteries. Okay, we have this $10 million plan that we're going to do to redo a bunch of cemeteries. Let's put a bid package together. Let's get this out to the public so people can bid on the job." And they'll handle the granular details. So while the mayor and the city council will decide we're going to redo a cemetery. After that funding gets approved, then the chief of staff may lead a couple different meetings on that with the commissioner of natural resources, the directors he wants to bring. You're definitely going to rope in DPW because, like, if you're in Massachusetts, there's water everywhere all the time. So like, you want to make sure that drainage is well structured. And I'll get roped in those meetings too because you want to make sure the financing packages are put together well. Because I have to then go explain to the bond market how we're spending this money, and then it just continuously kind of waterfalls down until it's a guy putting a shovel in the ground, digging a new fountain space in the cemetery. And I just think I'm very fortunate in my job that I get to see that. It's really cool to see. I do think I probably have one of the coolest jobs you can have.
Speaking of that, like when you're looking at that, like, so you want to fund something like this, how does that work from like from like a practical standpoint of how do you set the taxes? How do you get the taxes approved? How do you come up with this money to pay for everything, basically?
Yeah, so I'm one of those people who when I first started working for the city, I'm a math guy, and I was the person who had to learn how to structure the tax bills, how to raise, and we call it the municipal government, we call it the levy. So levy is how much we set to raise funds to operate the city, and so my job, my parent. It's great because I was talking to one of my oldest friend a couple days ago, and he called me up. He's like, his mom still lives in Quincy, wonderful woman, and he's like, she wants to talk to you. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, what's up? She's like, no, she's upset at her taxes. I'm like, yeah, no, there's nobody to blame besides me. We have a collector, our treasurer collector. So that's the same position in our city. A treasurer and collector is the same position. That's who physically collects your taxes. Um, she's fantastic, and I'm like, I said to her, she's been in the role like 2.5 years. I was like, are you used to your friends' parents yelling at you yet? Has that happened to you? No. So every municipality is different across the country, and it really depends on your state that sets it. But generally speaking, there's three things that fund your local government. The first is a tax levy. That's usually your largest. And when I say largest, I mean it's like 75 to 80% of your revenue comes from it. That is personal property tax. That is the taxes you pay for your house. If you're a business, it's the taxes you pay on your business. And if your business has really large assets, like big machinery, it's the personal property tax paid on that. The next largest source is state aid. So states will, as they collect revenue, if you're in Massachusetts and they're collecting income tax, they'll send that they take a portion of that and assign it to the state, from the state to the municipality. If you're in Massachusetts, which has a very, very high standard for our education system, you then have a separate appropriation called Chapter 70. that funds your schools. So you have to use it for schools. It's a huge, complicated formula for how we fund schools. Every state has a complicated formula. I'm not just saying it's Massachusetts. Um, and the third one is what we call local receipts. And those are, I get on this because people will say those are fees, those are charges, they are additional taxes. I'm like, there's no revenue that comes into the government that's not taxed. I don't believe that at all. Um, and
Mhm.
that's motor vehicle excise tax, that's meals tax. That's kind of whenever you pay business fee taxes, dog license taxes. That then comes in the city as local receipts or local revenue. I don't have the luxury of the federal government. I can't run a deficit, so every year we have to balance the taxes. So every year for the past about 5 years, I go up in front of the city council at usually the end of November, early December. The previous CFO, really, who I was really influential in my career, great man. He said, Eric, never forget you are a waiter in this scenario. The city council and the mayor vote on appropriations, and you are handing the bill to the city council afterwards and saying, this is the tax rate. Um, there are some kind of interesting parts about it. If you're in Massachusetts, you can divide that. You can shift extra tax burden to commercial businesses. It's called a commercial tax shift. That's common in Quincy. We do the most extreme version of that, which most municipalities in around Boston do, just because just land prices are so expensive. So you end up with two tax rates, and the tax rate for the residential taxpayers always is much lower. But yeah, so every year we have to show exactly how we spent every single penny, um, and then that becomes your tax bill. You divide that by 4, and the collector's office sends you a bill, and you pay it within 30 days, or sends it to your escrow account. Then they pay it.
So we're talking about that, like the accounts that you have for everything. Like, how is that managed? Like, I mean, like shifting money around, just making sure money is in the right account, right, the right way. Like, how that seems like a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, I have two things going for me. I have an excellent director of accounts, and we have a very sophisticated ERP system. So enterprise resource planning. I have a lot of friends who work in the private sector who are like, "You have an ERP," and I'm like, "Yeah, yeah. How would I ever manage 1,250 different accounts without an ERP?" And I think that's another that stereotype of local government is that we're still doing things pen and paper, when in reality we use pretty advanced software just like everybody else does to manage everything. This is where a lot of the responsibilities of my role come in too. We have the general fund, which is your general budget, which is the city of Quincy is about $430 million. That includes schools, fire department, all your day-to-day operations of a city. And then you go into different specialty grant accounts. In Massachusetts, we call them uh, Section 53 accounts. And there's all these federal programs that then trickle down to our books to address different things in schools, or CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, which is really targeted to low-income communities. Make sure there's street improvements, different revenue sharing that comes down from the states and coming down from the federal government. Nixon was the guy who actually put it in place, so it's been around for a while. But yeah, that's primarily where it comes from. Now, what's interesting is I gave that cemetery example a little earlier. That's a real one,
Mm-hmm.
except it wasn't 10 million; it was
Mm-hmm.
$16 million improvement plan. And so those are managed through capital funds, and capital funds are barred against funds. So the state gets a little. I'm going to go probably a little too granular here, but basically what happens is
Mm-hmm.
that we have authorization to borrow money, and the state has rules and regulations of how municipalities are allowed to sell bonds. But so does SEC, so does everybody, and we sell those bonds in the market. Now, right now, those bonds are non-taxable as long as they're being used for public use. They're non-taxable, and we take those receipts from those bond sales and we put them towards developing projects, and we pay those bonds back over time. We pay that out of the general fund, so capital funds and general funds are kind of married because that service comes out of the general fund. But then we segment those capital funds and spend them on these explicit projects, whether it's improving a cemetery, paving your roads, or a myriad of other things that you can do with capital funding. And then the other major category we have is grant funding, which as somebody, it's actually so. I don't know if I can say this, but it's December 31st. We're recording this, so this is a very hectic day for every municipality
Mm-hmm.
across the entire country right now, because ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, I read that entire act. I should have had that name down more, like more succinct. But under that provision, there's something called the Coronavirus Local Relief Fund, and it pumped just billions of dollars, about $150 billion, directly to municipalities across the entire country. Quincy received about $43 million directly, and then another $18 million on top for county appropriations. So we have to make sure all those funds are allocated and determined what they're going to be used for the next 2 years today, because 2024 December 31st, you either have to have the funds spent or assigned, or you have to send it back to the U.S. Treasury. It's probably much like my colleagues around the country. I mean, of the 61 million, I think we had maybe like $50,000 that had to be allocated to a couple outstanding, mostly related to school projects. But yeah, so it was a busy day of being like, because nobody wants to send back grant money to the federal government.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it worked. It was a very busy day in local government today. But those grant accounts, they're managed very specifically. Like there's a ton of, you have all the rules that apply, all federal and state and local laws that apply to all funds used by a municipality. But on top of that, grants have very specific instructions on top of those. We actually have an entire department devoted to managing these because it's so voluminous. I mean, we get tens and tens of millions of dollars in grants every single year that we have to manage directly. And there's huge cost savings for everybody involved, because if you overspend a grant, that has to get raised on your taxes. And if you underspend a grant, that's money that the people of the city didn't get and has to be sent back. So any efficiency gained there is super beneficial.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do in the general case, like if a city was to run out of money or something, like for things like is not budgeted right, or the other way, what happens when they have excess, like and it's not a grant, what do you do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, it's funny. One of the questions they ask you when, so I have to go in front of, I'm on Standard & Poor's rating calls for our bonds, just like any business would be. And, this is actually one of the questions, David, you'd be an excellent person. Actually, you would be an excellent person to be a bond rater. You got that, like, because they ask you such in-depth personal questions. Like, one of the questions is, what keeps you up at night? And occasionally I will go on a little bit of like a personal, like, my cat's been, I've been dry heaving. No, I answer that question very serious. But I mean, yeah, the idea of insolvency is terrifying. When I was younger, some of my first recollections of politics was Jefferson County, Alabama. And I actually have an economist who I had as a professor who was from Jefferson County, Alabama, and they were very famously went insolvent. That is, I mean, it's terrifying because I'm going to give you what happens when that, but from somebody who would sit in that chair with that news, you feel like I hate to say this, but you let down your fiduciary responsibility in a sense. How modern municipalities are structured, it's really not super possible anymore for that to happen, but it used to be a real thing. Now, in the state of Massachusetts, there's municipal finance oversight boards. And what they do is that they kind of are constantly investigating this. They're constantly trying to, poke and prod. And I like them a lot. Like, they're an important function of government where they're investigating that to make sure every bond sale, every action that you're doing is solvent. And part of our tax rate every year, like everybody talks about tax rate because that's what's interesting, right? How much you're going to pay in taxes? How much, are you going to call and yell at, how many, call and yell at Eric, or how many of Eric's parents are going to call him once a year to yell at him? But that's part of a greater process where you have to, file CAFRs, they're called Schedule A's in Massachusetts, combined balance sheets, and you're constantly submitting stuff to the state. In Massachusetts, we have the Division of Local Services, and the BOA, the Bureau of Accounts, which are constantly analyzing what you're doing to try and make sure. They're not like standing over your shoulder with a quill trying to correct stuff, but you're constantly proving to them that you're financially solvent, that you have these plans in place. And I personally love them. I mean, I think I get the biggest value of the BOA because I call them all the time. Like, I'm one of those guys who's constantly like, all right, I want to check this. This is new. I mean, the best thing about being 26 or 6 years old when you become the CFO is you're just like allowed to ask dumb questions. Like, nobody's like judging you. And we're also very heavily audited, very, very, very heavily audited. Where we part of being like in Massachusetts is I really have to know we have to be fluent in 3 accounting languages: GAAP, because that's where our basic financial statements are in because we sell bonds; GASB, which is Massachusetts used modified GASB, which is there's a whole different accounting standard just for government, because in government our biggest asset is our ability to tax. Well, that doesn't appear on a balance sheet, right? So you always have upside down liabilities. And I find myself explaining that to the public a lot, because they'll pull my balance sheets and be like, "Oh my God, the city has way more liabilities than assets." And I'm like, "Well, on the balance sheet, our biggest asset, which would be our ability to collect taxes, is not like a held asset. It's not like a engine sitting in the corner or a manufacturing facility. It's this law that allows us to do it. So our liabilities are always going to be pronouncedly higher than our assets, because collecting taxes isn't inherently a balance sheet asset." And then something called UMIS, which is the Unified Massachusetts Accounting Standard, Uniform Massachusetts Accounting Standard. So a lot of like my job is translation, which as an economist, I always say like economics is just like somebody who translates common sense and math. And so I felt like very at home, just constantly doing that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so you have a lot of state oversight that ensures that your municipalities are functioning properly. And hey, at the end of the day, there's exogenous events that can hurt municipalities. We've seen it in Massachusetts. We've seen it across the country. So it's good to have these agencies in there that when something bad does happen, they can step in and assist. The much funner question you ask is what happens when you have too much money,
Mhm.
and that really comes down to philosophy. So I often say that my view on taxes and stuff is like ideally government would never have $1 in surplus or $1 in deficit, right? You should a government be able to fulfill all its bills, but it wouldn't remove an extra dollar from the economy, because a dollar in the economy in the private sector is more efficient than a dollar in government, broadly speaking. Um, but from a pragmatic sense, what ends up happening is if you have just GASB, which is I think like 35 states all just pure GASB, it becomes part of your retained earnings and goes to stabilization or surplus. In Massachusetts, it goes through a process called free cash certification, which you take your operational budget surplus and you subtract any fund deficits you may have, and then that remaining funds can be allocated and assigned through the city council action. One way that it's different than the private sector, because I'm sure there's tons of people who listen to your great shows who have more private sector experience I'll probably have in my life. The way it's different than retained earnings is the administration doesn't get to freely allocate it afterwards. It actually has to go back in front of the city council, becomes part of the public process all over again. So you get this the public has a chance to to be intimate in understanding this process of reallocation of funds. I mean, it literally has to be a public meeting. It has to be voted on again. That's much more fun. I'll say that's much more fun to have more money at the end of the year. If you're me, it makes you feel a little better. You sleep a little better at night.
Yeah. Is that like typical, would you find, or is it you more run it close to the board?
No. I mean, we usually have like a 2 to 3% operational surplus, which is anywhere
Hmm.
from $6 to $12 million, which is again, given a $500 million operation, it's a small percentage against that. But in terms of finishing at the end of the year, because cities have predominantly fixed costs, that's vast. We don't have really that much variation. If we say the tax levy is
Hmm.
$312 million, we have the right to collect $312 million, and if we don't collect that, then you have a tax title process, and it gets liened against homes, which nobody likes. There's never been anybody who works in government who likes liening a house. That's just like not.
Hmm.
I don't know where that like myth comes from that people like leaning houses. I've never met anybody in this job who doesn't feel horrible when you have to lean a home or a business. It's not fun. It's like it's one of the worst
Hmm.
experiences. It's literally probably one of the worst experiences you can professionally have.
And then so you're not allowed to have debt. That's a general.
No, so we can have debt, but it has to be debt through bond sales. We can't have a budget deficit. So
Okay.
if like for example, if say I said the city needs $500 million to run, and we end up have $510 million in expenses, the state would actually come in and force me to raise that $10 million immediately. It would force
Hmm.
me immediately to go get legislation approved by the city council and mayor that I can then increase taxes by $10 million to collect that.
Okay. And then bonds. How does the bond process work for you guys?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It's the exact same way the private sector works. So that's probably I've been fortunate enough to be invited to speak at different conferences, and I was at CFO Brew, which is a partner of Morning Brew. They invited me down for the first conference, first annual like in person conference. It was a blast. Adam and his team are excellent, and so I'm sitting there, and we got that was one of the questions asked, because ironically the day I was down in New York for that was actually the day that Quincy sold the nation's first blockchain bond. And
No.
so it was very funny because you had about 300 CFOs there, and they're all private sector. I was the only public sector person there, and they did it really cool. It wasn't like on a podium; they actually had like sitting on a couch, like a talk show style, which is a blast. um, and I walked through the process, and I remember a couple of them came up to me afterwards. They were like, I was trying to figure out how it was different than how the private sector has to sell notes, and I was like, no, it's the same exact way. It starts with you get council approval for the authorization. The mayor signs it. We're going to borrow $10 million. We then have to. My department then builds a schedule of how those funds are going to be used. It gets analyzed by attorneys. We have financial advisors, and we have bond underwriters. So they all get together. They put together a package. There's all these disclosures. All the legal documents that's required. Then it goes over to the underwriter. What the underwriter does is they then market the bonds. So it's an open market process. So they call up all these different institutions. They tell them, hey, the bonds can be sold in 2 weeks. This is how much we expect the par value to be. This is how much we expect in premium. And then there's a software called Game Days, what's mostly used, and I love it because it's exactly what you think a software called Game Day would be. It's you log in. It's a big, looks like something out of the stock exchange, and say it's a 20-year bond. Every year, people put bids on. So if somebody wants to buy the year 10 payment, and in year 10, if it's a $10 million bond, year 10 over 20 years is going to be $500,000 in principal, and people will be like, all right, I'll want $600,000 in that year, and then somebody might come in and say, no, I'll take $550,000 in that year, and that's how it's negotiated. And usually have it way oversubscribed, so you'll have like of the 10 million you're borrowing, you'll have $80 million in offers, and then they squeeze them. So they call up these different firms and they're like, hey, what? I got a better deal. You got to squeeze that down. You got to squeeze that down, and they compress rates as low as possible. So you go from 8 times oversubscribed to usually like 1.5, and you get on a phone call one at the midday, maybe noonish, and all the bonds are confirmed. People have the money. That's the cool thing. If you buy municipal bonds, these large corporations, they have to give us the money that day. The money has to be liquid that day. It's not like you can't buy on a brokerage or margin. Quincy debt's very desirable. We're a AA rated community by S&P. We tend to get AAA prices. It's tax free too, so you end up with a lot of premium. So somebody may come in on a bond and say, I'm going to give you, let's say 1 year we are projecting to pay $1 million in interest. Well, let's say $1 million payment total. Now the interest on that, if it's 5%, is going to be $50,000. Well, somebody may come in and bid way underneath that, and you're like, wait a minute, why would you want for $1 million in debt? Why would you only take $970,000? Like, you're going to lose money. But that's because the tax advantages of municipal bonds is so great, even right now as interest rates are higher, that a lot of times these larger corporations, they just want the tax credit. So they'll substantially overpay us for these, and you end up with a par value. I had one bond we sold, and par value was 107. So for every $100, it was basically valued at $107 in market value, because the coupon rate's fixed at say 4 or 5%, and especially if it's like the market's like during COVID, the market was at we had a bond market when we had a band, which is a short-term bond that was like 13 basis points in interest, because our coupon rate was like 2% on it, and the Federal Reserve was at effectively 0%. So people are like, oh my God, I'm getting a 2% coupon payment, and the risk-free rate is 0.01%. Like, I'll pay way over that, because then I also get to write off all that interest I'm going to earn in taxes against my taxes. So it becomes very desirable. So I always say I have the biggest advantage in the world. I get to sell debt, but my buyers don't have to pay taxes on it. So I'm always going to get a better effective rate than the private sector. And the state and local bond market is something like $10 trillion. I looked at the Federal Reserve publishes this. It's a massive market. And so we follow a similar process that the private sector does. We just have a huge advantage because our buyers don't have to pay taxes on it.
How does that, looking at like the federal government, moving up from there, like when obviously the U.S. federal government's quite in debt, how does that work? Like, is it basically they have the same facilities for getting money, or how is the process different there, if any?
Yeah, there's certain ways. I'm going to put a little bit of my economist hat on for a second. Like, it's a little different. So U.S. government, it's funny. This is a question that recently has come up a lot in my classes, which people will say like, oh, the government prints money to pay its bills, and I'm like, no. Seniorage, that's that process. When governments print money to pay their bills, it's called seniorage, is illegal in the United States. It's why we continuously have debt ceiling discussions. You can't have a debt ceiling argument, but then also say the U.S. government prints money to pay its bills. So it's nothing is like the U.S. government when it comes to the ability to raise money via bonds. It's unfair to compare them globally to other nations because we pay back our money in our currency. So in theory, you could print about a bunch of money and pay off the U.S. debt tomorrow if you wanted to. And it's also the risk-free, it's essentially the risk-free rate. I mean, it is funny when you talk about like Federal Reserve action. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it's effectively increasing debt service payments for the U.S. government. Like if you kept it at zero all the time, that would be a much lower interest rate payment, right? Because it's borrowed off the federal funds, right? So it's a lot different in that sense because how T-bills are just so valuable. Like when there's so much demand when the Treasury puts out its notes to the secondary market, to the primary market, it's very, very efficient. Now, in terms of the difference when it comes to supporting that debt service is the U.S. government doesn't tax enough. I know that sounds horrible to say, who wants to get taxed more, but we have large federal deficits, and we've had them across both parties. It's not a political thing. It seems to be the one thing both parties agree on is deficit spending. So that's something that's not allowed at the local level. Like I can't deficit spend. I can't present something to the mayor and to the city council. I can't present them an unbalanced budget. I could present. We have budgets. We have years. If you look at my basic financial statements, that we've spent more money than we took in, but that delta is bonds. So I just borrow that money from the market later. It's not a balance sheet deficit. It's merely a cash flow deficit. The U.S. government can run balance sheet deficits, and they do. So that's I don't want to sound better, but that's like an unfair advantage people in the federal government have over local municipalities that they can deficit spend, and we simply can't because they can just go borrow more money. Who doesn't want a 5% treasury bill right now? Like,
so how does that work though? Like, so they can run a deficit, but I still I think like it's similar, but in an even grander scale of like the logistics of it. I just can't even wrap my head around like how that all. It must be incredible to manage.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny because it's so unique. And the other thing to remember about when you're at that level, when you're at that scale, there's nothing to compare it to. The federal government, the U.S. federal government, is the largest. It is by dollar amount the largest operational entity in the world. Like it dwarfs private. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, it's like a $3 trillion valuation. That's if you liquidate all of Microsoft. The U.S. government has years where it spends $6 trillion in its annual. Like one of the, it's funny. One of the things with everything going on in Eastern Europe, I had a couple students in office hours one time asking me about like the war, the Russian economy, Ukraine economy. I was like, just to give you scale, the U.S. government could spends in like 4 months or 4 or 5 months the entire GDP of both those nations. Like these aren't comparable goods at all, and so it's very unwieldy because it's so many sub departments that all have their own budgetary allocations. But and as we'll see, unfortunately, with some of these debt ceiling discussions we're probably going to have in the next couple of weeks, is that you find out that not every budget is created equal. Where one of the biggest critiques of the defense budget is that we tend to roll our defense budget, where we do these little appropriations throughout, not little, I mean, it's hundreds of billions of dollars, but we do them in small chunks throughout the year, which makes it really hard to invest in RDD. Sound like I was doing some modeling earlier, so I said RDD, regression discontinuity design, but I meant R&D, research and development, because you're just trying to pay your fixed expenses. You don't have the ability to, long horizon look and put money into how you're going to allocate money over time. At the local level, we plan out our budget annually, and we stick to that on an annual basis, where the federal government is allowed to kind of step by step do this. What's very funny is local governments are actually allowed to do that. You can do a monthly budget. Just nobody does it because it's completely unwieldy for like a town of 2,000 people to do a monthly budget. Mm-hmm. But we effectively do like quarterly budgets for a country of 350 million. And I'm like, we shouldn't be working backwards here. That should be done. We should do large budgetary approvals for long periods of time.
At what point does that, there's a lot of discussion in the news, at what point does that, from your economist background and your perspective, at what point does that become unsustainable at the federal level?
Yeah, I mean it's a unique question. It's a question I've been asked a few times where it's I don't think we've ever been here, right? I don't think we really know. I do retreat from the arguments, the fall of Rome arguments, because I don't think that's a good metaphor either. Because the U.S. economy is still booming; it's the powerhouse of the world. We've had insane GDP growth compared to all the other developed countries, and we've had way less inflation. We're still, the innovation capital of the world. You look at the average worker in the United States. I mean, there's over $100,000 in capital behind them. The production of workers, the marginal product of labor, is the first derivative. Is a labor function where I'm sorry, the production function where the labor input is driven to its first derivative. And it's a fancy way to say it's where labor supply equals labor demand. We have so much capital behind every worker that our workers are so productive. On top of that, one of the stats that economists look at to analyze this is something called the marginal propensity of taxation. And that's how much more could you tax your populace. In the United States, we have a very wide margin. You can still tax people a lot more and not, inhibit economic growth. You can't do that in Europe. Europe's tapped out on its ability to tax people, which is what's causing some uncomfortable times in Europe right now. I mean, there's talks about a sixth French Republic. I mean, who would have guessed that would be something in the news on the bingo card for calendar 25? Um, so where does it end? Well, there's a couple different philosophies. I'm certainly no expert in this. I'm an Austrian. I like to observe the economy, do some math, and figure out what people are thinking. God love my Keynesian friends who are trying to come up with ideas. But if GDP growth is greater than debt growth, that's usually a good sign that you're doing fine. At the end of the day, the U.S. is probably always going to have a deficit because we're wealthy. We're the wealthiest country on earth, and we're constantly, overextending our budget. But if we're overextending that budget, but it's relative to long-term infrastructure, long-term capital investments, that's okay. It's okay. Like if you own a house, it's good. That's good debt. I mean, I've had situations where I've had people say to me in public meetings that the city should have no debt, and I'm always like, "Do you have a mortgage?" And they're like, "Yes." I'm like, "Yeah." Like that's an example of not all debt's bad. When it's debt
Mhm.
that's derived from deficit spending, that's when you become concerned because there's something called Parkinson's syndrome, which is the idea that once government does something, once government spends money on something, it's very difficult to ever unwind that spending.
Mm.
And you combine that with another economic phenomenon called rent seeking, which is people vote for people who give them things. I mean, it's kind of like populism, but not really. It applies to all political leanings, not just populism. And that rent seeking combined with Parkinson syndrome, you end up with blooming federal deficits, and these federal deficits, if they're not supported with increased taxation, they increase the debt ceiling, um, or should they increase the debt load, and then you have to increase the debt ceiling. But if the debt is derived because you're investing in new roads and new port facilities, that's like good debt. If it's because you simply didn't bring in enough money, well, that's like kind of putting it on your credit card because you're just gonna have to do that expense next month or your federal government next year. That's when we start to get nervous. But if we ever see marginal propensity of taxation begin to compress, and you still have large deficits or deficits are growing, then you would start to have a problem from a macro side. And David, I do apologize. I just gave my calendar 25 outlook at a conference about a month ago, so I'm like way too amped up on this.
No, that's good. And what would happen? Like, so I think a lot of people like, so let's say the U.S. federal government, we can't pay our bills. Like, what happens? Like, where does what happens after that?
So I actually this is something funny. Probably about a decade ago, I was at a conference and this question got asked, and I won't say who the economist is because he's pretty well known. He probably would. I'm probably going to paraphrase him wrong, and I don't want to. I don't want to do that to a very good man. Who would make us collect it? He's like, who is the debt collector in that scenario? Now, the largest holder of U.S. debt is U.S. citizens. So by far the largest
Yeah.
holders of U.S. debt. Number two is Japan, and then you get to China. Um, I I don't know who would make us pay on it. I don't think that would ever happen. But I mean, there's been many wars fought over outstanding debt. Um, you could
Hmm.
argue the Desert Storm was fought over. It's kind of inverse though, because Iraq went into Kuwait because they owed Kuwait money. But not to
Mm.
get too like, and this is far beyond my round of expertise, but that's kind of a question that economists get asked a lot, and we always kind of flip it around and say like, probably is not something never to worry about because the U.S. could just print more money to pay its debt if it ever had to do that. It would cause inflation. Don't get me wrong. Printing money does not cause inflation. Printing money and putting it into the economy causes inflation. Um,
Mm.
there's a very interesting thought study that a lot of times I use it. I use it with my micro students, but I've always liked it, which is the question of if the U.S. printed a like, let's say we owe Japan. Japan owns 20% of our debt. Let's say that, so it's $7.2 trillion. If we printed a $7.2 trillion bill and gave it to Japan, would that cause inflation in the United States? I don't know.
Huh. Yeah.
And the fact we're
That's
not
good.
sure is kind of funny in of itself. Like, oh, could we just pay off our debt to everybody who's not a U.S. citizen? And would that suddenly, like, well, probably cause a lot of, like, horrible economic issues across the entire world? Um,
Yeah.
but no, we have many vehicles and not a lot of people who can make us pay our debt if they really wanted to, which is
Huh.
a little. I,
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say like I need to go to like military history there for a second, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, you do have a very powerful military and a very good geographic location for it. And I also think that there is that. So let's say the U.S. couldn't. I mean, obviously, it would be the U.S. citizens we wouldn't want to always make sure we're paying. So these other countries, it's like, hey, Japan, what if we gave you this economic incentive in a different way? We're not going to pay you this money this year, but we'll give you something else. Like it seems like there could be vehicles for that sort of thing
Oh,
uh,
y-
that might work out.
you're 100% right, sir. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's what China's doing right now with its Belt and Road Initiative, is essentially debt negotiations after they lend money. I mean, China doesn't want you to pay. They don't want to be paid back for the port they built. They want access to the port they built in your country. But no, you
Hmm.
could absolutely do that. I mean, hey, I think it was like a couple of years ago that England made its last debt payment from things from like that we lent them during Lend Lease that they ended up not qualifying for under Lend Lease because Lend Lease they could keep it if they used it afterwards certain means, but I forget under some circumstances they had to pay us back, and they just kept restructuring the debt. I mean, it was like the 2000s when debt from some wars in the 1800s was finally paid off, so you could constantly restructure. What you don't want to see happen
Hmm.
is what happened in Haiti, where it's that constant draining off of the economy, which is why Haiti. I mean, a lot of those payments from to France from Haiti really caused is what caused horrible problems in Haiti today. I mean, it's funny. Like I studied economics and I studied geology when I was in college, and I don't. I think like geology and geography explain a lot, and I think economics does too. And there's a article I read fairly recently, and it said the French are the reason why there's bad earthquakes in Haiti. And I was like, okay, okay. Hey, I'm open to ideas. These are clearly people smarter than me. I want to hear this argument. And I go into this like this is going to be some weird paper that's going to make no sense. It was beautifully written. They basically argued because Haiti had to deforest pretty much their entire side of Hispaniola, uh, and sell that to pay back the French. They had to build houses out of cinder blocks instead of wood, which is wood is A, easy to rebuild, and B, much more resilient to earthquakes. And it's why the Dominican Republic is like fairly resilient to earthquakes. And Haiti gets these earthquakes,
Hmm.
and they're absolutely devastating. I'm sitting there going like, that's a these people are a lot smarter than me. I was like, this is an incredibly good like ABC approach. And who would have ever thought that like what do they? I think they use the term French called it a reparation for Haiti becoming a free nation caused more earthquakes to be way more
Hmm.
damaging. I'm like, that is a interesting part of government that I would have never connected those two. That something in the 1700s could cause prolifically more damaging earthquakes in the 2010s. That's
Hmm.
fascinating.
That's that's fascinating. I think I think that's pretty good. I have two more things. What is there anything else you think just that people should know about local government, how it works, or like on anything related there?
Yeah, one of my in my TED talk I talked about it too. But one thing I first heard this term when I was like 16, and I've kind of been it's most interesting. I think it's one of the most interesting concepts I've heard in my life, which is the Aunt Sally effect. And David, I know you and I private conversations. You know my compulsion with this, but it's this idea that the more you get to know different people. the harder it is to dehumanize people. And what it comes from this observation, it was some I first read about it. Some Harvard economists described it. I believe it was in the 1960s, and they said they were perplexed by something. They said, you know, the U.S. How come there's less sectarianism in the United States than in other areas of the world that are more more homogenous in culture? And what they found is that if you're in the United States, you may have, and say you're if you're like me, you're a practicing Catholic, you may have an Aunt Sally who's a Buddhist, and you get to know Aunt Sally, you get to love Aunt Sally, and you're like, you know what? Probably a place in heaven for Aunt Sally, right? I mean, if she's not going, I'm certainly not going. And that spreads over time. That spreads over to every walk of life. And in my TED Talk, one of the things I discussed was I said, one of the beautiful things about local government is that we're not some two-dimensional pixelated picture on social media. That you get to become real people. And kind of that,
Hmm.
tongue-in-cheek example I gave earlier with the guy certifying the presidential election in your local town is probably also, umping the T-ball game later that weekend. But that's real. Like, you're the person who is making these decisions is the paving your roads. Your education curriculum is decided at the local level. That's not a federal or state action. That's local. That's your school committee. But these people making these decisions that really transcend partisan politics, that we can see that, hey, maybe this person disagrees with me, but this is the same person who pulled my car out of a ditch when I was 16 years old and went off the road during a snowstorm. Or this guy who may have a different idea of how to fund something, or maybe doesn't want this project to go through, or maybe flies a flag of a presidential candidate I don't like. Well, maybe he's the guy sitting beside you at church. Maybe, and the more you familiarize yourself that, the opposition, there's so much value and so much energy that I think gets put into dehumanizing people for their political stances and for how they operate. Um, you know, that it really becomes more beneficial at the local level when you start seeing them as like, do you know what? That guy hits the same pothole I hit every single day when I drive down Main Street. And I think finding that common ground, I think, is a way to stop some of this division that we see over these massive, you know, just these massive political schisms we see at the national level. And I think that starts with local government. I think it's starting with, hey, 75% of times we interact with government, I'm going to be interacting with somebody. The person I'm looking across from, say, in the collector's office, is somebody who lives on the same street as me. Like, I do think there's so much value in that. I think if we start looking local first, I think there's gonna be a trickle up effect of that
Hmm.
unification.
Yeah, I agree completely, and you see it even on like so many people, anything that's in the public, you have sort of like the celebrity version of the person, and then you have like the real person. And if all people see is this celebrity version, it's sort of like there was a skit, I don't know, a decade or two ago or whatever. There's a famous baseball player called Robinson Cano. He used to play for New York, and then he played for the Mariners for a little bit. And when he went back for to the Yankees, like to play with the Mariners, the TV show did a skit. They put a little cardboard cutout of him, and they had New Yorkers come up and they just say what they think of Robinson Cano, and they're just they're going off on him. They hate him. They're swearing. They're doing all these things, and then they would have Robinson Cano step out. The real Robinson Cano step out from behind the cardboard cutout, and it was just people flipped instantly. It was like 1 minute they're talking to the celebrity Robinson Cano, and they're just they hate him, whatever. He's the worst human in the world. The next minute there's a real person standing. That's really Robinson Cano. He's just a guy, and he's standing, and they would instantly flip to being super friendly, like, hey, like, how awesome to meet you. Like, it's so, thanks for all your years here, like, playing, and you're a great player, blah, blah, blah. And it was just this switch, and you could just see one, they're talking to celebrity, one, they're talking to the real guy. And I think it speaks to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I mean, what really, you're 100% right. It is funny. I've had more than a few occasions in my career where I've had people rightfully, and I always say this, people like, I have constituents call me. I'll have constituents call me upset, and I'll tell them like, "Oh, I'm not arguing with you. Yeah, no, you're my boss. You pay my salary. What do you want to talk about?" And a lot of times, the more you talk to them, the more friendly they become. Some of the people who call me most often, and I have great relationships with, are people who, I mean, I've had people go up. You can watch this on YouTube. Have gone up and called for my position to be cut out of the budget, who I now consider friends because they've sat down and talked with me. But I've had a few kind of funny occasions in my career. I had one fairly recently, where it was a constituent, and she was very upset. And we were outside a meeting, and I sat down and I talked with her, and she was, It was going fine. She was polite, but and rightfully so. She has a right to express herself. And she stopped at one moment and looks at me and goes, "You look really, really familiar." And I was like, "Oh, like oh, I hope you don't watch too many council meetings. I'm on there sometimes." They're like, "Oh, you'll see me around and stuff." She goes, "No, I can't place it." And I was like, and in my head, I'm like, this constituent came into my father's gas station a lot when I was a kid. And and I look at her, I go, I pumped your gas a lot, and she goes, face just drops, and she's like, "Oh yeah," and I was like, "Yeah." She goes, "Oh, I went to your family's business since like your grandfather owned it." I go, "Yeah," and then she's like, what's your name?" And I'm like, which is weird because like she heard me say my name prior, but I think it shows that clicking. Her attitude towards me, she sent me like nice emails and stuff, and I'm just like, oh, and nothing's changed. Like nothing
Hmm.
positionally has changed politically or anything like that. And I think that's one of the funny parts when you engage local government is that because there's that weird mixture of politics as part of government, inherently part of government, is that people expect us to be more confrontational. I would love if somebody came in and sat down and was like, "I want to learn more about local public finance." I'm like, "This is. Do you want a coffee? I can talk to you for 4 hours. It'd be great." um, like, what the other part about local government that's kind of interesting is that we tend to be far more transparent than federal government. My office publishes a year-to-date, line-by-line, year-to-date budget every single day. Every day at 9:08 a.m. I have no idea why it's 9:08 a.m. Our ERP system shoots out data to a website, and you can click on it and say like, "I wonder how much the police department spent on overtime." Click a button; it will show you exactly how much we spent on overtime. Um, like you and I'm well, and I don't think the federal government does that, if I'm being honest. I don't think it's that transparent. I don't know if I'd want the government to be that transparent with like secret military spending or something like that, but we don't have that problem at the
Yeah.
local level. So
Yeah.
we just have a much greater opportunity to be more direct. And I always encourage people, come talk to your local government people. We're nerds. We love this. I can tell you right now, there's not a single person like me in the Commonwealth and the country who wouldn't love if some random person came in there and was like, "I want you to tell me about selling bonds." I'd be like, I have a little sheet I give constituents so I can show them the step-by-step process because I want them to learn. I mean, like, it's awesome. I mean, we do tend to very much like our jobs.
Well, yeah, and that's been my experience too. Coming chatting with you guys every time, it's like and talking about the history and everything. You guys are history buffs about your city and state and all this. Like, yeah, it's great. It's partially why I wanted to have you on for this because I knew it'd be good. I think one more thing. So you did a TED talk. I think a lot of people you see people doing TED talks, and it's like how does that come about? How does that work?
Yeah, so I was in my I was going into my second year of I was in my last semester of my first year of graduate school, and
Hmm.
they had they started doing a TED talk at West Virginia University, and they asked for a bunch of applications. They wanted people from all different, some graduates, some people moved out of the state, some people who I think we had one gentleman on there who had no relations to the university. But they just put up a big failure, and they got a lot of applications because the people who ran that are absolutely excellent. And you have to come up with a script. You have to come up with a topic on why you want to do it. They usually just pick a theme. So our theme was if not. It was called "If Not Now, When," and that's how I got my "If Not Here, Where." And
Hmm.
so my whole topic was on like tons of presidents started in local government. George Washington was in local government. John Adams was in local government. Thomas Jefferson was in local government. A bunch of them were surveyors, by the way. Like, I don't know, like surveyors not a thing in local government anymore, but it was apparently incredibly important at that time. And but most presidents started at the not most, but a huge percentage of presidents started in local government and then worked their way all the way up to to the highest office in the land. And what was funny about because it's such a forgotten part of government. It's so weird to me that people talk about politics. They talk about what they want their government to do for them, and they ignore the largest portion of the government. The thing that has real tangible change. Like one of my proudest moments in local government is we were involved in the opening of a new special needs school. So during this time, we had just received funding. We were moving some federal funding we had gotten to build a special needs school. And this is what kind of like inspired me to pick this as my topic because I'm sitting sitting there going over the financing for it. School ended up costing about $40 million altogether, and I literally could not think. Like most economists, we can be kind of negative. Like we always think of what the flip side, the flip side, the flip side. What about? What about? And I could not for the life of me figure out a bad thing about doing this. And I remember one of the things I loved about it is probably, and this is what made me decide to put in the application for that talk, was as we're sitting there, we're going through it. We talked about installing a special need playground. In the school has two special needs playgrounds in the back, and Quincy has several special needs playgrounds. And I was sitting there going, "Is there anything better than a special needs playground? Like, is there anything better than financing a special needs like that is such an amazing thing. Like to be able to open that up
Mhm.
to all different kids that they can all like freely play equally in here. Like, what's better for galvanizing people together than that?" As time went on, as I start writing my TED talk, as I start that process, the school just kept getting better and better, and it started adding speech therapy. And I went to speech therapy for 7 years as a kid. It had physical therapy, occupational therapy, and I was like, I think more people need to know that this is what their government's doing. This is the really where the rubber meets the road. It's not these divisive political dialogues that are happening on Washington D.C. No, it's on Main Street. It's like this is where it's happening. Like you can go into your council chambers on a Monday night and hear people saying, "Hey, your tax dollars are going to go to opening this school that's going to help kids with special needs." That's the positive stuff people need to hear and need to understand that local government
Mhm.
is a way for us, one, to be more united through something like that, through the Aunt Sally effect, but two, to not be so poisoned by what always sounds like bad news and negative news coming out of DC. We should be informed about DC, and we should absolutely be something on the front of our minds, but it shouldn't get to the point where it becomes this dividing force. And I think when we lump all government together, we forget that at the local level there's so much good going on. um,
Mhm.
and so that was like my pitch to the board that selects. So there's usually a panel that selects which TED talks they want to do, and you submit like a video. Like, usually it's kind of cool. They only give you like a minute to pitch what you want. Like you got to be quick.
Mhm.
And then you have to do a write up, and then you send that in. And I heard I think it was a couple of weeks, and I heard back, and then you go through the process of drafting the TED talk, which is laborious.
And then, and once you do the process of doing it, like, what's the actual process? What's the when you actually get to doing it? What on the day? What like how's that? How'd that work?
Yeah, so um, you go the day before. They do with anything. They do the sound check, and they make sure that you understand where the lights are going to be and stuff. They only like ours. They only let 100 people in the room, and you have to stand on a big red circle. And I'm
Mhm.
very lanky and uncoordinated, David, as you know, and so I'm trying not to fall off the circle because I want to pace really bad. But it's a very
Yeah.
bizarre feeling because you're not allowed to write anything down. You're not. There's no teleprompter. And for every couple weeks for the previous 6 months, you're getting on a call with the one or two members of the TED Talk committee, and you have to recite your speech, and you have to
Hmm.
really get it down. Like I'm somebody like I'll go give presentations and just not prepare for them because I enjoy the conversation. This was unlike anything
Hmm.
I'd done before, where you have to have this like rote memorization of what you're going to say. But it's really funny. So after months of doing that, I'm going through like the day before the sound checks, making sure everything's going well with the lighting and all that stuff. And the guy walks over, the gentleman who ran it, really good man. He walks over to me and goes, I go, I'm just nervous. I've never had to, memorize like 10, 12 minutes of speech. Like that's like, that's like memorizing like 12 to 1,800
Hmm.
words. And he goes, oh, just remember, nobody knows what your speech is. And I'm like, what? Where was that for the last last 6 months? I loved it. I was like,
Yeah.
what a way to. And it eased me immediately. I was like, this guy knows people. And then the day you
Yeah.
show up, they throw you in a green room. Usually, it's like they have three go break, then another three. So I was the fourth guy to go. So I was right after the break, and you go out there. It's very very sweaty because you're under so many lights, and I'll tell you, they do a great job editing it because they made me actually look half decent. You get a slideshow, and you burn through it. You try and slow down when you can because all you have is a clock. It starts at 18 and it counts down to zero. Like you're 90% done, and you have like 10 minutes left, and you can be less than 18 minutes. They don't want you to go to 18 minutes, and you're just sitting there like oh, am I gonna be able to do the last 2 slides in 12 minutes? Is that gonna be? You're like, of course you should be able to.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but no, it was it was a really excellent process. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for coming on
Oh, thank you, David.
and
Thank
sharing
you.
with us about everything. Yeah, I think that'll be good for the day.
Awesome.